The question I want us to think about and try to answer over these next 2 weeks, remember we're doing two-parters, this is part one, is this. Is killing another human being always wrong, or are there times when killing is permissible and even the most righteous course of action to take? You can phrase the question a bit differently by saying like this. When is protecting human life at the expense of human life right or necessary? So the goal of this first class period is mainly to introduce us all to this ethical topic of the protection of human life, or put in the negative, just this topic of killing. How do we think Christianly about this? And so we're going to address 3 different topics that are all very related to one another. Okay, so we're going to be talking about self-defense, we're going to be talking about capital punishment, and war. Okay, self-defense, capital punishment, and war. That's 3 different topics. So this is somewhat ambitious. I think we can do it. And today my goal is to get us thinking about this, try to show some of the complexities of the issues. And to do that, we're going to walk through sort of like a test scenario, a test case on each of these different topics. And I thought that it would be fun to go through actual historical examples. So that's what we're going to do. So without further ado, we're going to start with self-defense. So listen to this story. Who remembers, it was about 3 years ago now, 3 to 4, the Kyle Rittenhouse case. Yeah, very good. So some of you have some context here. I'm going to read just a little bit in case, just to refresh your memory, and then I want us to talk about this case. The unrest in Kenosha, Wisconsin began on August 23rd, 2020, after police shot Jacob Blake. And remember, this was all about race. It was white police, and they shot a black man, Jacob Blake. An event that spurred protests and by night led to significant rioting. The city of Kenosha saw extensive property damage, including vandalism, looting, and arson, primarily in its downtown and business districts. Vehicles, local businesses, and government buildings were damaged or destroyed. The escalating tension drew armed civilians to the area, some to protect business or property. This is where Kyle Rittenhouse comes into the story. His involvement in Kenosha, Wisconsin unfolded during these intense protests and riots after the police shooting of Jacob Blake. On August 25th, 2020, Rittenhouse, then 17 years old, traveled from his home in Antioch, Illinois, to Kenosha, claiming his intent was to help protect businesses and provide medical aid. Armed with an AR-15 rifle, Rittenhouse joined others in guarding property. During the night, confrontations escalated. Rittenhouse was pursued by a man named Joseph Rosenbaum, whom he shot and killed after Rosenbaum allegedly reached for his gun and threatened to kill Rittenhouse. Attempting to leave the area, Rittenhouse encountered a crowd, where Anthony Huber chased him and struck him in the head with a skateboard, leading Rittenhouse, after getting knocked down, to fire, fatally wounding Huber. Shortly after, Gage Grosskreutz approached him with a handgun. Rittenhouse fired, injuring Grosskrewitz's arm. Rittenhouse turned himself in 1 hour after these events took place and would go on to argue he acted in self-defense, fearing for his life in each encounter. His trial, widely publicized, hinged on the question of whether his actions were justified. Ultimately, in November 2021, just 3 years ago, he was acquitted of all charges. The verdict ignited a nationwide debate over self-defense laws, vigilante action, social justice, and gun rights, with some viewing Rittenhouse as a defender of self-defense rights and others seeing him as a vigilante figure who should be locked away. So that's the story. That's the background. I have a question. There's a question.
Wasn't he only like 17?
Yeah, he was 17. Now, none of us are likely ever going to be in this exact situation that Kyle Rittenhouse put himself in. But we may be in a situation where we have to ask ourselves the exact same questions that Rittenhouse had to ask himself, both before and during those few moments. So, what are some important questions you think Rittenhouse and we need to ask ourselves in situations like this? What do you think, Sherry?
Is there any other solution besides killing this person?
Yeah. Is there another way out? Like, do I have to kill this person in this situation of self-defense? Is there a way I could defend my life without killing this other individual? Okay. Any other questions we need to think about? I've got a list of a whole lot. Brian?
If I die and I go to heaven, and if that person dies and they go to hell, which is the better person to die?
Okay. That's an interesting way to go about that question. And, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, especially for Christians to think about, like, if they're going to go to hell and I'm going to go to heaven, well, that's a willing sacrifice. That's a sacrifice I'm willing to make.
That was
kind of idea
by our missionaries in Vanuatu. When I was talking with him.
Oh, really?
He presented that. And I was like,
interesting.
Oh, that's an interesting point.
We're taking away their chance to become safe.
Yeah.
We're taking away this person's chance to become safe.
Yeah. Yeah, thinking on the human responsibility aspect of salvation there, and yeah, that's a good question. Emma?
I think going back even further, what question would be like, do I have to be here in the first place?
Yeah, because he was there protecting personal property. Is that kind of what you're getting at? Like, why?
Was the property worth people dying?
Right. Do we value our stuff more than we value the life of someone else? And that really comes into play with this Rittenhouse case.
Whose stuff, though? What property do you own in Kenosha?
It was either, I think he had his like mom lived in Antioch and his dad lived in Kenosha or something. So he had friends and family who were in Kenosha, and that's why he went there in the first place.
It wasn't his property though.
It wasn't his. Yeah, in that zone, he didn't have any personal property, but he was protecting the property of like his friends' parents' businesses and stuff like that were being like righted against. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, my notes are all messed up. I had many technical difficulties today. Go ahead.
So I think that was kind of a question of what's my personal responsibility, but also, is this a situation where it's not my business, or is this a situation where I feel called to help someone else who isn't able to take care of it themselves?
Okay. Yeah.
Defending the innocent.
Defending innocent. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Is it legal for a 17-year-old to walk around with an AR-15? Yeah.
I believe I don't remember the rules in Ohio at the time. I think you could open carry, but I really don't remember.
Long rifles, I think you can open.
Yeah.
I thought it had to be like your own. Can't you not own your own playing team? You just can't buy one.
Yeah, I think you just can't buy one. But also, the question you're raising is bigger, in that when we are wanting to defend ourselves, what local laws, like, should we keep in mind local laws and regulations? That's a good question. Trent?
Back to the original question, we kind of pulled that together.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of good questions, but your question what do you consider when faced with that situation? So, defending your life, or
Mhm.
taking another person's life. Really, that question is irrelevant to what led to that, right? At the point that he's sitting there with a rifle in his hand and his life is threatened, it really doesn't matter why he's there. Like, the moral question isn't why were you there. The moral question is, when you're there, what is your right or obligation?
Yeah.
Because you don't get to control why you got put in a situation. There's a whole bunch of reasons why he should or should not have been there.
Yeah.
The question is, what does he do?
Yeah. In that moment when you're being threatened with someone who has a gun and they're saying, I'm going to kill you. Okay. Hopefully you've thought about this issue before you're in that moment. In fact, I've got a little bit of a funny story. I want to make sure that we have time for this. We don't. Okay. That's crazy. Okay. Ask me all this story later. It's really funny. Okay, so those are all some good questions. I want to make sure I get through all of this. You guys actually asked the main ones. Like, first of all, is it ever right to take the life of another human being in self-defense? That's the obvious question we're trying to answer. Is it ever not only right but commanded and sinful to not defend yourself and your family? So, we're asking about rights. Like, do I have the right to take this person's life? But is it ever actually morally, are you morally obligated to take someone else's life in this situation? I think that's a good question. And then obviously, second, what constitutes self-defense? You guys hit on this. What level of threat does there have to be to merit lethal self-defense? Do I have to try and de-escalate, like no matter what, before it gets to that? And if I have access to a non-lethal method, like do I prefer those in all circumstances? Like if I have pepper spray or a taser gun or even like I don't know, a baseball bat is not as lethal as a gun or something. Yeah, the big one, if someone just wants my personal property, no. If someone wants my personal property and I know that's all they want and my life's not in danger, they just want my property, that's kind of it's a different question than I don't know what they want. They might just want my property, but I don't know that, and they seem a dangerous threat to my life. You have to think about that as well. Okay? Yeah, there's other questions, but we got to move on. Okay, let me read a little bit on this topic of the death penalty. Okay, so I'm going to give you another situation to think about on this topic of the death penalty. Okay, Eleanor Louise Cowell was born on September 22nd, 1924, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. She had a difficult childhood with an abusive father, Samuel Cowell, and an oppressed mother, Eleanor Cowell. The family also had a concerning psychiatric history. Right? Eleanor Louise Cowell, she was later known as Louise Bundy, was the devoted mother of one of the most infamous serial killers in American history, Theodore Robert Bundy, commonly known as Ted Bundy. Okay, who knows about Ted Bundy? Should be mostly everyone. Maybe some young folks don't. Okay, so despite her son's heinous crimes and murderous legacy, Louise Bundy's support and love for her son never wavered. She staunchly defended his innocence until the very end. This unwavering maternal faith provides a poignant backdrop to the horrific cruelty displayed by her son. So this is just an article. It's not my words. Okay, this is an article. For the sake of time, it's a little bit on their history. So this Ted Bundy, or Louise ends up getting married, and Ted Bundy has a stepfather. And the article writes, despite this new family structure, Ted Bundy remained emotionally distant from his mother Louise and stepfather Johnny. As a teenager, Ted became increasingly independent and introverted. He later described his high school years as a period of pronounced depression. Okay, so you have this poor childhood experience for Ted Bundy. Louise's quiet life was suddenly upended when Ted was arrested in 1975 for the kidnapping of Carol Durange. Shortly after, more allegations tying him to multiple serial murders surfaced. Louise faced a waking nightmare as evidence mounted against her son. Witnesses and survivors stepped forward claiming that Ted Bundy was responsible for numerous brutal murders and attacks on young women. Bundy had even been placed at multiple crime scenes. Faced with such overwhelming evidence, most parents would recoil in horror. But that's not what Louise Bundy did. So Ted Bundy, he's convicted, and he ends up confessing to over 30 murders, and many people think that number is actually well over 100, which is insane. At the end of his life, he gets sentenced to the electric chair. He gets the death penalty, and he gets a phone call to his mother. And at the conclusion of this call, Mrs. Bundy told the confessed serial killer, "You'll always be my precious son." And she said, "We just want you to know how much we love you and always will." She says, "We're all praying for you." And Bundy says this, that God's Spirit was with him. The mood at the Bundy home was grieving but subdued. Mrs. Bundy raised her voice only when asked about the death penalty. So all this comes back to this idea of the death penalty. And she says, listen to what she says, "I think it's barbaric. What good does it do? It's legalized. Murder is all. It's not a deterrent. They've been killing people for thousands of years in executions, and what good has it done?" Despite Bundy's confessions, his mother Louise maintained her love and support for her son until the very end. The final conversations highlighted the emotional complexity between a remorseful son and a grieving yet forgiving mother. Okay, so that's the brief story of Ted Bundy and his mother. So my question is this. I guess first of all, does anyone have any initial thoughts about Louise Bundy and her son in this article? Some questions that came in my mind. Did Ted Bundy's mother truly love him? Why or why not? You guys have any thoughts on this article? Sherry?
I don't think she did, because she never went into the consequences of his actions. That if a normal mother would, yes, I love you and everything, but you do realize you laid in your own bed, you made your own bed, now you have to lie in it.
Okay.
Because you did all this, you have to be punished for it. And that punishment, unfortunately, is death.
Yeah. So, Sherry, what you're saying is forgiveness can be had, reconciliation can happen between, Ted Bundy and his mom, but you're kind of getting at there's a difference between a sin and a crime. Like, he still has to be punished for his crime of his horrible actions, horrible evil. So you're saying he's still got to face up for his crime, even though his sins can be forgiven. Brian?
No, the orthodox answer, right, is no, she didn't love him because she wasn't truthful with him. I disagree with that. I think she loved him deeply, but she is a terribly weak and flawed person, and through her own weakness, she didn't do the things that she should, which allowed him to continue in a bad path.
Okay.
And she loved him more than she loved God. And
Yeah.
his directions were, right?
Sure.
She chose him over obedience to God. She should take him out and stone him.
Yeah. It's interesting too. Louise Bundy she was also a devout Christian lady. So she's arguing almost based on. I think she would later go on to argue based on Christian principles that the death penalty is barbaric, which is what she said in this article. Yeah.
She probably thinks she loves him, but she doesn't. I don't think she you said she had a history of mental problems or something.
Yeah. Well, the family. Yeah, her family. The whole family is. Has lots of issues.
So she probably doesn't understand fully the situation and isn't fully aware of what actually loving someone to help them get better and understand the thing.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So she probably thinks she.
Yeah. So to answer this question of whether or not she loved him or not, I think we have to ask some other questions. And I think it would come back to our standard for what love is, which is really at the heart of the problem. And here's one of the questions I have. Does God's Old Testament law inform at all our concept of love and justice in the New Testament era? Okay, does God's Old Testament law inform at all our concept of love and justice in the New Testament era? Does the law of Christ in some way change the Old Testament standard of justice? So Brian mentioned, take him out and stone him. Okay. Does the coming of Christ and this shift in the ages change some of the Old Testament law and how we apply them in the New Testament era? I think that's an important question. Here's some other important questions I think we have to ask about this. Just concept of the death penalty in general. Is it right for us to desire the punishment of wrongdoers? Is that right? Is it right to desire someone who has wronged you to be punished by the government? So let's make it a little personal. Someone has wronged you. Is it right for you to desire them to be punished, whether it be death penalty or not? Okay, if capital punishment is okay, under what circumstances should it be employed? Like, when should the death penalty be applied? Is it only when someone takes the life of another individual? What about other heinous crimes? Okay. Should we want the death penalty to actually be employed by flawed man who can make mistakes in judging? We've all at least seen or heard of cases where they put someone in prison for life and then it comes out, oh snap, we were wrong. Right? And then how does forgiveness come into play here? Which I think is what Brian was talking about. Okay. There's a bunch of questions we could ask about capital punishment. And if it truly is the most moral and therefore loving choice for certain evil actions. And we're going to get to those. We're going to get to those next week. For this week, we've got to keep moving on. Okay? So, I'm going to give you one last scenario real quick. This is on the topic of war. I want to see how you guys think about this. Actually, I'll probably just tell you how I think about this. Okay. This is on the American War for Independence. The American War for Independence began over the colonies being taxed. That tax was equivalent to 1% of their income. The issue for the colonists, however, when do we go to war? Right? The issue for the colonists, however, was not the amount that they were being taxed, but that they were being taxed by England without representation in England's parliament. You see, the colonies were largely self-governed under charters of England that granted the colonies their own parliament. So the colonies had their own parliament, not England's. Okay, separate. These charters constituted that the only governing body that was allowed to tax the colonists was that of their own. Well, after a king in England died and the subsequent king was overthrown, Parliament in England had far more power and thus exerted this new power on the colonies because they needed the money. So, king dies, king's overthrown, who needs to step in? Parliament. That's why you kind of see who has the power in England right now. It's not the Queen. It's the Parliament. Okay? Same thing's going on here. So after a series of acts like the Sugar Act that imposed a small tax on sugar, we had the Stamp Act that imposed direct tax on paper goods in the colonies themselves. That was a big one. The Townshend Acts that imposed a tax on other imported goods, glass, tea, paint, paper. And then you have the famous Tea Act, which allowed England to bypass colonist middleman merchants so they could sell directly to the colonies and sell directly to them and directly tax them through those goods, further exerting foreign tyranny over trade. And then finally, we have the Intolerable Acts, which were a series of measures taken against Boston after the Boston Tea Party. Okay, so the tyranny England had over the colonies had nothing to do with how much they were being taxed, but that they were being taxed at all without representation in English Parliament. In other words, the colonies wanted to uphold their constitutions, but England was attempting to usurp them. See modern parallels, maybe? Okay, this led to a war that was largely led by Christians who advocated for war with England. See that again? This led to a war the war was largely led by Christians, okay, who advocated for the war with England because they believed the war was just, because it was against a tyrannical government. Okay, so once again, my question here is, man, what kinds of questions do you think these colonial Christians had to ask themselves before committing to go to war with England? That's a big deal. They ended up going to war for 8 years. I'm just going to give you some of my questions because there's not enough time. Okay, so here's some questions that I think of in regarding to that's important to think about when we go to war. Do we have a just cause in going to war? Is there a just cause? Do you believe that the colonies had a just cause over a 1% tax? Right? What makes a war just? Okay, define just. Who has the authority to declare war? Okay, can anyone declare war on another nation? Who has the authority to do it? Is it clear that the actions of the enemy are morally wrong and ours are morally right? Like, are you the one who's going into another nation to pillage them and destroy them, or are you acting in self-defense? Is it ever right to go invade another country? Is that ever right? So many questions. Are we sure that our intentions are pure and that we want to protect and uphold righteousness, and there's really no ulterior motives? Like, is this a proxy war? Like, are we just doing this because we want to affect these people over here? Is this really our last resort? Must we go to war? Will the good results that come from victory be worth the significant harm and loss that will come from the war? Like, is it worth it? That's actually pertinent to the colonies. They pulled that off somehow. Okay? If a Christian believes the war is unjust, should they still be compelled to fight? Should there be criminal consequences if they don't? In other words, should there be a draft? It's an interesting question. And another interesting thing about the draft is if it is a just war, then your people should want to fight it. So why is there a draft? It's interesting. And then you can ask, should women be in the draft? Right? You can ask all kinds of questions. Okay, questions regarding how a war should be fought. So we have questions in going to war, but Christians have more obligations than just that. Okay, you have to also think about how a war should be fought. Okay, should we try to ensure only the amount of destruction necessary to win the war is caused? And how do we know that information? And this, I think, has been hotly debated recently with Israel and Palestine. How much destruction is necessary to win this war? And should we go to measures to ensure non-combatants are unharmed? What are those measures? And if we take those measures and yet the enemy is holding non-combatants, what do you do? If they're just holding them hostage, what do you do? Right? How do you fight this war? It's also important when you think of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and weapons of mass destruction. What do we do with those we capture? How are we to treat them? Should we desire true peace with the enemy, or should we desire just to beat them so bad they can never threaten us again? There's so many questions, guys. Should women be put in combat roles? Is it okay to kill women and children because you're at war? You have Old Testament stories where God commands destruction, destroy everyone, all of them. How do you think about that? Lots of questions, and I wish we had more time to engage, but we just don't. So I'm going to try to answer. Okay, there's like a lot of questions. I'm not going to be able to answer all of them, but hopefully this gets you thinking for next week. Next week, I'm going to give basically a brief argument for the position I believe in that is right on all three of these issues. A good thing for you to do throughout this, it's actually 2 weeks. You have 2 weeks to study. Study these topics, just do a little bit of Googling, and then come back next week and have an opinion, maybe at the end of class next week, or if there's time, we can discuss a little bit. Okay? That's the roadmap, and that's where we're going. Hopefully this helps you in thinking through just some of the complexities that go into these issues. Okay? Let me pray for us, and then we'll be done. Well, today we're trying to cover a decent amount of ground. We are talking about the ethic of protecting human life. By the way, if you haven't got a handout, there's a stand back there. You can avail yourself of that. That'll help you as we go through. So we're talking about the ethic of protecting human life, particularly capital punishment, war, and self-defense. What does the Bible say about these things? Is it ever right to take a human life? And in what situations would it be permissible or maybe even necessary? The foundation for sort of this entire conversation is in Exodus 20, verse 13. It's the commandment, you shall not murder. You shall not murder. And this commandment, by the way, is repeated multiple times in the New Testament. It has an abiding validity for us today. It's repeated in the New Testament, said in the Old. And a lot of this topic revolves around this question, what does the word murder mean? Some translations actually translate this, you shall not kill. So what does this word mean? Well, the Hebrew verb that's translated as murder is ratzak, which means murder or slay. That's the word used in Exodus 20, verse 13. Ratzak. It means murder or slay. This verb is used in the Old Testament to refer to, specifically, the unlawful taking of a human life. What we call murder in a criminal sense today. For example, this same verb is used in a different form to speak of a murderer in Numbers 35, 16 to 19. The verb is also used to speak of causing human death through negligence or carelessness. Okay, but ratzak is not the ordinary word for judicial execution, capital punishment, and it's never used to refer to killing in a war. That's a quote from Grudem's Christian Ethics. So, there's what we learn from this. There's a distinct difference between murder and kill in the Old Testament. There's a distinct difference. There's two different words similar to how we use the words today. Murder is unlawful or unrighteous killing. Accidental killing would fall in this category as well. So this means there are two categories of killing. There's righteous and there's unrighteous. So from the beginning, the foundation for our argument has to be this. That the Bible has two different categories for killing, righteous and unrighteous. This is foundational. So the question we have to ask ourselves, well, when is killing righteous and when is it unrighteous? Because the Bible has two different categories. When is it right to take a human life, or even necessary? Well, the Bible specifically, it says that capital punishment in killing in war falls in the category of killing, not in the category of murder, just by the way that it uses the word. Okay, it never uses the word ratzak, the word for murder, to talk about killing in war, and it's typically not the word for judicial execution. Okay, so this means that capital punishment in killing in war can be righteous actions. So now let us, with that foundation, knowing that there is a difference between murder and kill, let's get into the issue of capital punishment. And we're going to hit all these. We're going to do capital punishment, then we'll talk about war, and then we'll talk about self-defense. So the main question for capital punishment is this: should governments take the lives of people who are convicted of capital crimes. So the question that we're not addressing today is, for what crimes should someone be put to death? We're not trying to answer that question. We can discuss that some other time. The question specifically that we're wanting to answer: should government take the lives of people who are convicted of capital crimes? Is that within their authority to do? We can start with a brief overview. There's a good pocket dictionary of ethics book that describes a bunch of ethical issues. I think it's helpful in getting just a good overview. So capital punishment is the legal execution of an individual as the penalty for a crime, usually murder or sedition. Capital punishment has pre-Christian origins. In the modern era, it has come under sharp criticism by many ethicists who condemn it as an inhumane punishment. Christians are divided on capital punishment, some supporting it on the basis of a variety of considerations, including Old Testament practice, and others rejecting it as a violation of the biblical injunction against murder. Okay, so it gives a really broad, high-level overview of the issue of capital punishment. So now let's get into what the Bible actually says. In Genesis 9, 5-6, it says this. You should see this on your sheets as well. And for your lifeblood, I will require a reckoning. By the way, this is God speaking to Noah. This is within the Noahic covenant. Okay? For your lifeblood, I will require a reckoning. From every beast, I will require it, and from man. From his fellow man, I will require a reckoning for the life of man. Verse 6, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image. Okay, so shedding blood throughout Scripture is used as a euphemism for murder. Okay, and you can check out those Scripture references there. But it's a euphemism for murder. A euphemism is a word or phrase that's used in the place of a more direct or offensive one. Okay, so for example, we often speak of when someone died. You say so-and-so passed. That's a euphemism. Shedding blood here in Genesis 9:6 is talking about killing somebody. Okay, this is just a different way of saying that. And we see that God delegates to humans the authority to put to death those who murder other humans. Okay? Specifically, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. And the reason God gives for this command is that mankind is made in God's image. So capital punishment is put in place because human life is so precious. And some people will argue against capital punishment for that exact same reason. They say, human life is so precious, we shouldn't take it. We should not allow the government to take it in any way. But God argues completely opposite that point. He says, well, because life is so precious, I will allow a human government, man, to take away the life of another man who took someone else's life. Okay? And this command is given to Noah as part of the Noahic covenant before the nation of Israel was constituted. This is before the nation of Israel was constituted. So this means the command has an abiding validity for today. Think of the sign God gave to Noah, the rainbow. A sign that he would never flood the earth again. This is in that same context, that same Noahic covenant. That sign abides forever. God will never flood the earth again. In the same way, God gives to man the command to capitally punish those who take the life of another human being, because life is so precious. So the conclusion from Genesis 9, at least, is that God gave to human government the authority to carry out capital punishment, and this delegation applies to all people at all times by merit of being part of the Noahic covenant. Okay. Now let's see what Romans 13 has to say. Romans 13, 1-7. It says this, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. But you have no fear of the one who's in authority, and do what is good, and you will receive his approval." And then verse 4, "For he," the government, "is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. Because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing." And he says, "Pay to all what's owed them," etc. So, what we learn from Romans 13, government is God's servant for the good of humanity, and government carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. This is consistent with Genesis 9, where God delegates to humans the authority to carry out God's justice on those who do wrong, like unrightfully taking a human life. Okay, specifically, the government carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Government also does not bear the sword in vain. By the way, a sword is not an instrument to open packages or spread butter. Okay, swords are used for a particular purpose. It's to kill somebody. And you can see some references there. In Scripture, swords are used to kill. Human government is given the authority and the responsibility to take human life justly. Okay, the government does not bear the sword in vain. This is not some metaphor. This is specifically how human government carries out God's wrath on wrongdoers. Now, a question we have to ask ourselves is, okay, if God has given that authority to the government, is it ever right for us to desire the government to punish a criminal who has wronged us? Is that ever right? We remember the context in which Romans 13 exists. Romans 13 is right after Romans 12. It says this, "Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but instead leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord.' To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. For by so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." So God says, if someone has wronged you, don't avenge yourself. Instead, there's a proper channel for this vengeance that God has given to you, and that is the government. Right? Leave it to the wrath of God, and who bears God's wrath? Well, we learn in Romans 13 that it's the government. Okay. Specifically, it says in 13:5, government carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. So instead of taking personal vengeance on someone who's wronged you, go through the proper channel of vengeance, government. God's solution to personal vengeance or vigilante justice, just taking justice into your own hands, is human government. If you have a question, write it down, and we can come back to it at the end. Just because there's lots to get through. If God's provision to us for vengeance is government, then why would it be wrong to desire and use that provision? This is the argument. If God's provision to us for vengeance is government, why would it be wrong to desire and then use that provision? That would be like saying a desire for sex is wrong because God has provided only one proper channel for the expression of that desire. Just as a desire for sex in its proper context of marriage is right, so the desire for vengeance in its proper context of government is right. Okay. And some people will have some objections to this view. One of the objections, and this is one of the primary objections for all three, of these different categories, self-defense, war, and capital punishment, is Matthew 5:38 through 39. This is when he's in the Sermon on the Mount, and he says this: "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also." And so the objector would say, doesn't this verse show that seeking any kind of vengeance is wrong? Should we not instead turn the other cheek? Okay. Here's how I would answer the objector. First, this verse is not talking about government, but rather how people relate to one another. Okay. Fundamentally, this is a different category, similar to Romans 12:19, where Paul says not to seek personal vengeance. Same category. Second, this verse is not talking about an evildoer beating someone up. Okay? If you're getting slapped by someone who is right-handed, and they're slapping you on the right cheek, are they slapping you like this, or are they backhand slapping you? Which direction is it? If you're getting slapped on your right cheek, you're getting backhand slapped. Okay. A slap on the right cheek in this context is not a threat of violence. This was rather an insult at this time. This is not someone who is threatening to kill you, who is threatening to beat you up, who is trying to rob you, whatever it is. This is specifically an insult. A slap on the right cheek, it's a backhanded slap meant to insult someone, right? Not attack them. So this verse is not talking about the government's role in vengeance or justice. It's talking about your personal responsibility in your relationship with one another. And it's not even talking about a crime or someone threatening you. It's about someone insulting you. So it's fundamentally different. Okay. What about loving your neighbor? So Matthew 22:39 says, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." So the objector says, if you seek vengeance after someone, you're not loving your neighbor. Capital punishment is not loving neighbor. Okay? This is how I would answer that objection. Jesus is quoting from Leviticus 19:18. Okay? And in Leviticus 20, verse 2, it's just a few verses after, it says this: "Any one of the people of Israel, or of the strangers who sojourn in Israel, who gives any of his children to Molech, shall be put to death." So, clearly, the death penalty was not in contradiction to love. Right after the verse that says, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself," we have a law that says, if anyone gives his children to Molech, kill him. He shall be put to death by Israel's government. Okay, so clearly it's not in contradiction. In fact, the death penalty fulfills the law of love by putting to death those who hate neighbor, so much so as to murder them. This law is given after this category of "you shall love your neighbor as yourself" to fulfill it, not in contradiction to it. Okay? The Bible does not think these two things contradict. Okay, there are other objections and arguments, but that's the gist. If you have any questions, write them down. We can come back to it later. But we're going to go ahead and move on to war. The topic of war. Okay. I don't know if you guys have this quote on your sheet. I'm going to read this quote. It's really good. It's by Charles Hodge. He says this: "It is conceded that war is one of the most dreadful evils that can be inflicted on a people. That it involves the destruction of property and life. That it demoralizes both the victors and the vanquished. That it visits thousands of non-combatants with all the miseries of poverty, widowhood, and orphanage. And that it tends to arrest the progress of society in everything that is good and desirable. It's also conceded that wars undertaken to gratify the ambition, cupidity, or resentment of rulers or people are unchristian and wicked. It is also conceded that the vast majority of the wars which have desolated the world have been unjustifiable in the sight of God and man. Nevertheless, it does not follow from this that war in all cases is to be condemned. I just like that quote. That was pretty good. So the main question in this topic of war is war ever just, and how would we determine if it is? Is it ever right to take the life of other human beings in war? And how do we determine it, if it's justified or not? Well, our Pocket Dictionary of Ethics, it helps us here give us a broad, very high-level overview of just war theory. It says this: just war theory is a moral perspective on war that delineates the criteria under which such combat can be deemed ethically justified or justifiable. Although Cicero may have been the first thinker to articulate a thoroughgoing theory, the Christian attempt to grapple with this idea finds its beginnings in the thought of Augustine. During the barbarian invasion of the Roman Empire, Augustine suggested that even though no war is ever fully just, the reluctant and restricted use of force by Christians might be necessary when charitably defending a neighbor from an assailant, such as the foreign army's attack on Rome. So, in the wake of Augustine, Christian thinkers devised various versions of the theory. A war is generally considered just if and only if it is waged for a just cause, is motivated by a just intention, comes as the last resort, is pursued by a legitimate governmental authority, has limited ends in view, exempts non-combatants from attack, and carries a reasonable hope of success. He gives a lot of criteria for establishing whether or not going to war is just or not. In the modern age, he continues, the debate over just war theory has intensified as weapons of mass destruction made it increasingly difficult to differentiate between combatants and non-combatants, as well as to wage war with reasonable hope of success. Okay, it's a good overview of just war theory. And we'll talk about it a little bit more in just a moment. Okay, so argument number one in favor, by the way, I'm just giving the positive view for the most part. So argument number one in favor of just war theory is, remember, the Bible never calls killing in war situations murder. It calls it killing. It never uses the Hebrew word ratzak, murder. Okay? Number two, government has a responsibility to protect its citizens from foreigners. And we get this, we can argue there, or we can get there just by simple reasoning from Romans 13:4. Remember, 13:4 said, government is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid. For he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. And in 1 Peter 2:13-14, it says, be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil, and to praise those who do good. Okay, so here's the basic argument. If government has a responsibility to protect its citizens from its own murderous citizenry via the sword, then a government likewise has a responsibility to protect its citizens from hostile outside sources via the sword as well. This makes sense. It's just an analogous argument. I think the logic of it is very tight. I'll say it again. If government has a responsibility to protect its citizens from its own hostile, murderous citizenry via the sword, then it just makes sense. A government likewise has a responsibility to protect its citizens from outside sources via the sword as well. We also see this sort of thing in the Old Testament. Judges 2:16-18 says, then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hand of those who plundered them. Then verse 18, whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he saved them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who afflicted and oppressed them. Okay, so at a high level, God raised up men specifically for war, to save Israel from their oppressors. And this saving would include killing and going to war with these nations. Okay, remember, these judges would war against Israel's enemies and would kill them. We also see in Psalm 144:1, David says, "Blessed be the Lord, my rock, who trains my hands for war and my fingers for battle." So David thanks God for training his hands for war. And nowhere is David cited for being unrighteous, for killing in battle. Okay. So the conclusion so far: governments have a responsibility to protect their citizenry in both Old and New Testaments. So if that's true, how can we know if a government is doing this right? How do we know if a war is just? How do we determine when we ought to go to war? Questions like these. Well, you'll see all of these criteria in your handout. For the sake of time, you have those for you. You can read those. That's a quote from Gruden's Christian Ethics. Just know there's two categories. How do we know when it's just to go to war? And then how do we know, how should we conduct ourselves in war? There's two different categories. He lists those there. I commit those to you. We don't have the time to cover every single one of them. So let's go ahead and go to the pacifist objection. Okay. The arguments commonly used to support pacifism are: 1, that Jesus commanded us to turn the other cheek. And we've talked about that. Number 2, Jesus commanded us to love our neighbors as ourselves. 3, engaging in military combat involves failure to trust God. Number 4, we should depend on international law rather than going to war. 5, the use of violence always leads to further violence, and pacifism should be adopted to stop that vicious cycle. And 6, more genuine Christian pacifism would have prevented previous wars. There are 6 objections. By the way, pacifism is this idea that there's different flavors of pacifism, but the idea is we should never take the life of another human being. Some people broaden that out to everyone. Some people just apply that to Christians. But the general idea is you should never take the life of another human. Okay, that's pacifism. So I've already addressed the first 2 arguments for pacifism previously. Remember, that's Matthew 5:39 and 22:39. And argument 3, engaging in military combat involves failure to trust God. That's just simply not true. If you remember, Israel went to war and trusted God multiple times. So those 2 are not in contradiction to one another. In fact, when they trusted in the Lord, God gave them victory. And when they went to war and they didn't trust Him, He gave them failure. Argument 4, we should depend on international law rather than going to war. Romans 13 does not address an international conglomeration of nations. Romans 13 addresses nations. Nations have sovereignty, not some world order. Okay, so Romans 13 is specifically talking about nations. He's not talking about some global world order. So not only is that an unbiblical idea, it's also very scary and just not a good idea. Okay, we see that in attempts to do that in our world today. Not good. Okay, argument 5: the use of violence always leads to further violence, and pacifism, if adopted, would stop that vicious cycle. Okay, that's also not true, that violence leads to more violence, and that is a consequentialist argument, not a Christian one. Okay, so Christians, we're not consequentialists or utilitarian. That's the idea that the outcome of an action drives its morality. We're Christians, we say no, the action itself, what God says about the action itself, drives its morality. Okay, so the morality of the action matters more than its consequences. Okay, argument 6: more genuine Christian pacifism would have prevented previous wars. you see this here, that argument is basically, well, if history and the facts were different, then that would prove my point. And that's not a valid argument. Okay. Also, if we were to just argue logically, pacifism would just lead to tyranny, not peace. Okay. I blew through that. More could be said, I hope. You're getting at least the gist of the arguments. Very high-level overview. Okay. Just war theory makes the most sense of the Bible's teachings on war and killing. I think far more than pacifism. Those are the main two. Okay. Moving on to self-defense. The main question is this. Is it ever right to use lethal force when defending yourself? The pocketbook of ethics didn't have an overview for self-defense. I don't know why. So it's not there. So we're just going to go straight to relevant biblical teaching. It says this. 1 Samuel 19:10. And Saul sought to pin David to the wall with the spear. But he eluded Saul so that he struck the spear into the wall, and David fled and escaped that night. So what I'm going to do now is, as we go through some of these teaching, just kind of build an argument here. So firstly, it is clearly okay to run away from danger. I think a pacifist would also agree with that. It's okay to run away from danger. Or, thinking of Matthew 5:39, 38 and 39. Or should David have been more like Jesus in this situation? Should he have turned the other cheek, so to speak, after Saul threw the spear at him? Maybe he should have given the spear back to Saul and said, "Hey man, you get another shot. I'll turn the other cheek to you." Right? Obviously that's a sarcastic argument, but it's kind of a ridiculous scenario. So yes, you can run away. Paul escapes the clutches of the governor of Damascus through a window, and we also know Jesus escapes an angry mob. So escaping, running away, that's a valid option. There are also passages on self-defense against animals, and in a court of law, our focus is specifically against physical attack. So that's what we're trying to target. So let's look at Exodus 22, verses 2-3. If a thief is found breaking in and is struck so that he dies, there shall be no blood guilt for him. But if the sun has risen on him, there shall be blood guilt for him. This is fascinating. What does Exodus 22 say? Breaking in at night, if you break in at night, that is equal to you are able to righteously kill that person. You will have no blood guilt. But breaking in during the day equals unrighteous killing. Okay. So what's the reason behind this? Does this mean that if the sun's up, someone's attacking me, well, the Bible says I can't defend myself? I don't think so. There's reasons behind this. The reason for this law has really nothing to do with the rising and setting of the sun. The principle behind this law is this. If your life is perceived to be in danger, in critical danger, then you may lethally defend yourself. If your life is not really in danger, the sun's out, you can clearly see the person's not a threat to you, then you may not lethally defend yourself. Also, in the daytime, there's more likely to be other witnesses who can help you prosecute through the proper channel of vengeance, which is the government. So, those are two key reasons why I think Exodus 22 says what it says. And yes, this is under the Old Testament law, which is not binding for today, but that doesn't mean that this isn't instructive for us. Okay, we can look at the principle, the reasons behind God's law, and help apply that today. Okay, we also see in Esther 8, verse 11, the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives. to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods. So remember in Esther, the decree of the Persians, you can't take it back. And so there was a decree that said, you can come against Israel. And then God, through Esther, helped pass another decree that said, okay, even though that one's passed, Israel can defend themselves, and they can do so with lethal force. Okay? So God providentially, in the book of Esther, passed a law that said, or helped the law pass, that said Israel can defend themselves, and they can do so with lethal force. So God providentially saves Israel by allowing them to defend themselves. And if God forbade the use of self-defense, lethal self-defense even, then why would he use such a law to protect his own people from annihilation? Okay? And so, and a common objection to this is Matthew 5:38 and 39, and also, once again, it's not loving to your neighbor to defend yourself, right? Those are common objections. But we've already addressed those. So, before we summarize, I want to give a funny story. I want to give this one last week. This is an interesting, I think this story is funny. Okay. And I believe this was told to me, I believe this is a true story. Whoever told it, they said it in the first person. I adopted it and summarized it for our purposes. Okay. So, a young 17-year-old man, he had just joined the Navy, and he had ported in some foreign city. He was young and had just made some of his first good money he's ever made. So he decides to go to a local store and buy himself a buckskin coat. Upon coming out of the store, a group of 3 thugs came up to him and told him to give them all of his money. And he responded with a hearty, "No, thank you." And the thugs obviously didn't like that response. And so, as thugs do, they punched him in the face. And this young Christian man, remembering the Sermon on the Mount, knew what he had to do. Well, he knew he must turn the other cheek, obviously. And so, he gets up, he turns the other cheek, and they punch him in the face again. And then he turns them the other cheek again, and they punched him in the face again. And eventually, the thugs, sick of this, knowing that they're not getting anywhere with this guy, they just told him to give them his coat. Okay, you don't have to give us your money, just give us your coat. Well, this was the first fine purchase of this young man, and it was very expensive. So instead, he gave in, and he simply gave them what he had in his wallet. And they left him alone. Later on, however, as the man went back to his bunk, he found himself feeling guilty. Because the verse right after the one that says to turn the other cheek says, if anyone wants to take your tunic, you're supposed to give it to them. Right? And so, I find that a humorous story on... Yeah, well, okay, if you missed the punchline. The punchline is, he applied Matthew 5:39, turning the other cheek, but he wouldn't give them his tunic. Okay, so that's the punchline of that story. And I find that humorous because it's just an example of how we tend to take Scripture out of context and apply things in funny ways. Okay, so a summary of the arguments are this. Okay, killing and murder are different words that describe different categories. Murder is unrighteous killing, but killing can be righteous. Okay, killing in war is never called murder in Scripture. Capital punishment is typically not called murder in Scripture, and self-defense is said to not incur blood guilt. Okay, so murder and killing, different categories. Number 2, killing via capital punishment can be righteous because God delegates to human authorities the right and even the command to kill at least those who shed innocent blood. And the proper channel for personal vengeance is through the government. Okay? Number 3, killing via war can be righteous because God commands national governments to promote the good of their citizens, and biblical principles inform us when a war is just and how to justly go about said war. And finally, number 4, killing via self-defense can be righteous because God's law allows individuals to protect themselves and their families when there's a lethal threat towards them, and God even used a self-defense law providentially to save his people. Okay? We flew through that, but I hope that at least gives you an overview on the Christian ethic of protecting human life, particularly self-defense, capital punishment, and war. I think it's permissible in all 3 categories. And it's important for us to think through this in case there ever is a war. And for us young people, if there ever is a draft, and we're drafted to go into the military, we should probably have this figured out. So even if you don't, if this overview didn't help you get settled, you need to get settled. If there ever is a draft, you need to get settled in case someone ever comes to rob you, or threatens to kill you, or breaks into your home at night or something. This is important. You have to, in the moment is not the time to go get your Bible. It's the time to figure out whether or not you're a pacifist and you're going to run, or if you're going to go grab a gun or something. Okay? I know the Bible's called a sword. That's in that moment. That's not what you use. Okay? And then capital punishment, as we argue for good laws in our land, we should have this figured out.